Good morning, everybody. We are live from the Big Phil Palace in Aurora, Ontario. I am your host, filling in for one John Pollock. I am the Big Phil Combo, Phil Chertok, joined as always by the one, the only, the Sultan of Sudbury, the Emperor of Elden Ring, one Eric Marcotte. Eric, how are you doing on this Sunday morning?
Wow, that was a hell of an intro, Phil. I'm doing fine. Glad to have you back. It's been 5 months, which is pretty much the turnaround between fights for fighters. So I think you're officially on the MMA schedule. You show up once every 5 months, you get your big win in, and then we see you down the line when you're ready for another one.
Well, I've learned that you need to have a good negotiation period. You can't just be taking fights every single month. I mean, it doesn't work out with those quick turnarounds. At first it's okay, but then it comes to bite you in the ass. So we're here to talk about UFC 294, which went down yesterday from Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, the Etihad Arena. A lot of changes in the last 2 weeks to this card. Originally, the main event was supposed to be Islam Makhachev versus Charles Oliveira, a rematch for the lightweight title. Instead, we got Alexander Volkanovski versus Islam Makhachev, another rematch from a great fight from earlier this year. And then the co-main event also saw a change as Kamaru Usman stepped in on short notice to take on Khamzat Chimaev, with the original opponent Paulo Costa having to be pulled from the fight. So before we get into the action, Eric, just wanted to get your thoughts on the changes that occurred to this card. Well, how excited were you for the original two fights? And these changes, was that an upgrade? Was that a downgrade?
Okay, let's start with the co-main event before we get into the main event. So we originally, of course, had Khamzat Chimaev versus Paulo Costa scheduled. Paulo Costa, a fighter who has been scheduled a lot over these last few years, but hasn't fought all that often. Honestly, you could say the same thing about Khamzat Chimaev. So when that fight got scheduled, I think there was a lot of skepticism about whether it would actually come to fruition, and it did not. Unfortunately, Paulo Costa was forced to withdraw from the fight. We have Kamaru Usman stepping up on 2 weeks' notice, and for me, that was a far more interesting fight than Paulo Costa versus Khamzat Chimaev. I mean, Costa is a talented fighter; he's a hard hitter, but honestly, I really favored Chimaev by a considerable margin going into that fight. I wasn't sure how much Costa was going to have to offer for him, and for a fighter like Kamaru Usman with his laundry list of accomplishments and impressive takedown defense to be the guy stepping in at middleweight, no less. I was far more into that fight. How about you, Phil?
I was a little bit higher on the Costa fight. I mean, I know it had been a while since we'd seen him in the octagon, and there had been some, he's obviously had history of not being able to make some fights, but I really thought that this one was going to happen. And then, his elbow surgery and staph infection happened fairly late along the lines. And I liked the fight more than the Kamaru Usman fight because Costa is a natural middleweight. And I really wanted to see Khamzat go up against a true middleweight. We'd seen him tested at 170 against Gilbert Burns, and he'd had a relatively easy time in his few middleweight fights. So I really did think that Costa was going to be able to challenge him. And the fact that Usman was stepping in, great fighter, but super short notice, not his first fight at middleweight. So while a very skilled opponent, one of the best welterweights ever, one of the best fighters in the world, I wasn't sure how much it was going to tell us about Khamzat at middleweight. And I think after we get, to the recap of the fight, there still remains a lot of questions about what Khamzat can do at middleweight after his performance in this one.
Yeah, and we'll get to all that later, but we might as well head into the main event changes now, because this event was, of course, set to be headlined by the rematch between Charles Oliveira and Islam Makhachev. Oliveira pulls out, nasty cut above his eye. Alexander Volkanovski steps in. Both rematches, of course, but the first fights between the two couldn't have been any more different. Islam Makhachev just kind of walked through Charles Oliveira in his first fight, dropping him before submitting him in the second round. While his first fight with Alexander Volkanovski was very competitive, some even debated the scoring of it. So I think people immediately after those initial bouts were certainly more interested in the Volkanovski bout. But given the circumstances heading into this one, this was a bit of a downgrade to me personally. I didn't think on 2 weeks' notice Alexander Volkanovski was going to be able to do more than he did in that first fight. While I certainly thought Charles Oliveira was capable of much more than he showed in his first fight against Islam Makhachev. So I was a bit disappointed by the replacement, and also a bit disappointed that we were kind of throwing away the Makhachev Volkanovski rematch on 2 weeks' notice.
Yeah, I agree. I think the I think 2 weeks notice is obviously a challenge for anyone, especially going up against Islam Makhachev. Where it really bothered me was more so the fact that Volkanovski was just coming off of hand surgery. And had he not had that hand surgery, had we known he was still in the gym doing his, his regular routine, there had been a lot of rumors that he was going to be headlining an event in January, potentially in Toronto. So the idea of him being in a training camp or being training regularly would have made it a lot more appealing of a rematch, even on that short notice. But the fact that he had that surgery, we know he was out of action for a while. That's kind of what made it feel a little less than optimal. And you could see it in his physique. He didn't look quite as solid as he did in that first fight with Makhachev. He just seemed a little bit softer. I mean, still in good shape. Like, he wasn't like some out of shape guy, but you could just tell he just wasn't as strong and chiseled as he was earlier this year.
Yeah, I agree. It just wasn't the best situation for a rematch. That definitely would have had a lot of anticipation going into it. And that's not to say that people weren't anticipating this. If you're in the UFC's shoes here, I think this was as great of a short notice replacement as you could possibly pull out of your hat to keep the pay-per-view buys up. But just from a personal perspective, I was looking forward to the Oliveira rematch more. And I was a bit disappointed by the fact that we were we'll get into it, but this kind of closed the chapter on this rivalry when I don't think today or yesterday should have been the end of it. But hey, we might as well jump right into it.
Yeah.
Islam Makhachev, Alexander Volkanovski 2. The rematch, their initial fight, that is, was actually only like in March of this year. It feels like or February. It already feels like a lifetime ago. MMA moves so quickly, but Makhachev won that fight by unanimous decision. They both start out with a bit of a feeling out process on the feet. Volkanovski defends Makhachev's first takedown defense, but he's not really doing much offensively. While Islam is getting to work, he's throwing some leg kicks, working his jab. Eventually, they start wrestling in the clinch, where Volkanovski is able to match Islam in terms of strength and getting the better of the positioning. But it is Islam who kind of sinks in that high clinch where he starts to land some solid knees to the midsection and the chin of Volkanovski before they separated. Volkanovski looked fine coming out of it, and they kind of reset in the center of the cage. And it wasn't long before Islam lands this beautiful left high kick that just rocks Volkanovski badly. And Volkanovski manages to stay on his feet, but he has nowhere to go because he's right next to the cage and he's hurt bad. And Islam just swarms him with strikes against the cage, dropping him hard and quickly finishing the fight with ground and pound. So Islam Makhachev wins by knockout at 3 minutes and 6 seconds of the first round, retains his UFC lightweight championship for his second successful defense, both against Alexander Volkanovski. I expected Islam Makhachev to win this fight, but a first round knockout, a spectacular one at that, certainly a surprising result. What were your thoughts watching the fight ending sequence here, Phil?
Yeah, I mean, really masterful performance by Makhachev. He pretty much had a flawless performance. I mean, he did miss that early takedown, but it wasn't something that he committed super hard to. Volkanovski was able to reverse the position against the cage, tried several takedown attempts of his own, but none of them were successful. Islam looked super strong when he had the tie clinch in this fight. It looked like that could be a very difficult position for Volkanovski, and repeated leg kicks, body kicks, ultimately set up awesome fight-ending sequence with the high kick and then the ground and pound to end it. Just really a perfect performance, and just cementing himself as not only the number one fighter at 155, but now I think he really shoots up the pound for pound rankings, and it really comes down to him and your opinion of where Jon Jones sits in that world. So tremendous performance. And now it really begs the question of what's next for him. I mean, do you go with the Oliveira rematch that was originally scheduled here, or now you've got Justin Gaethje coming off that huge high profile head kick knockout of his own against Dustin Poirier? I think a lot of people might be clamoring for that fight as the next one for Islam.
After the fight and the press conference, it sounded as though the UFC was gonna go in the Oliveira direction, going towards the rematch instead. It wouldn't shock me though if they do end up going with Justin Gaethje. Obviously, he's a very popular fighter coming off a strong win. It'd be a first-time matchup, so you have a lot going on there. The argument against that is I do think Charles Oliveira is a better fighter than Justin Gaethje. He beat him fairly quickly not that long ago, so I can see the case for going right back to that rematch with Islam Makhachev as well. Either way, I think Charles Oliveira and Justin Gaethje are probably the two most exciting fighters in the entire sport. So you can't go wrong with either of them in a headline position. But I think Islam Makhachev will be a sizable favorite, regardless of who his next opponent is. And in my opinion, yeah, he's solidified himself as the top pound for pound fighter in the world.
Does emphatic win by Jon Jones next month change that ranking at all?
No, for me, Jon Jones's current ranking kind of reminds me of when George St. Pierre came back in 2017, beat Michael Bisping, and immediately shot to the top of the pound for pound rankings. It's like you're very much judging this. If you just want to judge his entire career's worth, of course, Jon Jones has an incredible resume. It's unmatched, basically. The same as when George beat Bisping and came back to the top of the rankings. But if you're just judging based on recent work and quality of opposition, then I don't actually think there's any argument to be made for Jon Jones being in the conversation.
So what does this do then for Alex Volkanovski? I mean, we've only seen him with one defeat ever in the UFC. That was earlier this year. That was to Islam, unanimous decision, although, some people debated it. I had Islam winning that fight personally. Finished here pretty brutally. He asked in the post-fight interview for the UFC to keep him busy. It sounds like he wants to stay on that UFC 296 card in January. What do you think about that turnaround? Obviously, he's not only dealing with concussion, but he got a pretty bad cut over his eye because of the head kick. Do you think it's reasonable to turn him around in that time? And does this change your thoughts on that potential matchup with Elliott Topuria? Because even though Volkanovski lost earlier this year, and of course this fight and that fight were at 155, he's kind of looked invincible at 145. So does this loss change your perception of him? And does it make you give Elliott Topuria more of a chance in that fight?
If the fight happens in January, then definitely I'd give more of a chance to Topuria because I think that's a very quick turnaround considering all of the physical issues Alexander Volkanovski seems to be facing at the moment. And in his post-fight press conference, he did seem very down and desperate just to stay busy. So I'm not going to speculate about what's going on in his life, but it seems like a bit of a rough period for him. And I don't think that taking this fight against a killer like Topuria in January is a fantastic idea. With that being said, I still favor Volkanovski in that fight. He's looked amazing at featherweight. He's beaten the best of the best, and he's made it look easy. His last fights against Yair Rodriguez and Max Holloway, they weren't even competitive. So I'm not sure that Topuria has had that performance. That, I mean, as great as Topuria is, there hasn't been that moment where I'm like, oh, this is the guy who's going to beat Volkanovski at featherweight. I haven't seen that yet. If it happens in January, though, I think a lot of people will be putting some money on him, just in case.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what those lines are because Volkanovski has been such a sizable favorite at featherweight up to now. And I think that just the nature of this loss and the timing of when that rematch potentially occurs could definitely shift those lines to be a lot closer. All right, so moving on to the other replacement last second fight, we have Kamaru Usman, former welterweight champion, taking on Khamzat Chimaev at middleweight. Usman coming off of 2 consecutive losses to Leon Edwards. So you kind of gave us your thoughts already on this potential matchup. So why don't we just jump into the action, Eric?
We start off the fight after a bit of an intense face down as they were being introduced. Usman defends Chimaev's first takedown, but he gives up his back on the process, and Chimaev just kind of drags him down repeatedly against the cage, just wearing on Usman, who hasn't really trained for this fight, who hasn't been in camp. Chimaev takes Usman's back on the ground. He locks in a body triangle, and he's starting to look for a rear naked choke. Usman does his best to escape out from under Chimaev. He even gets back to his feet at one point, but that body triangle is still locked in, which allows Chimaev to keep hunting for that rear naked choke. At one point, the positioning was pretty solid. I don't know if he was quite under Usman's chin, but he was close at the very least. And what Usman does in response is he just throws himself full force forward onto his and Chimaev's face. And it works because it shakes Chimaev off of him, or at least it loosens the choke, so he is not in danger of being submitted anymore. Chimaev's still on his back, and he stays in that position for the remainder of the round. So this is basically 5 minutes of dominant back control time for Chimaev. Not a ton of damage done, but he was certainly in a position of nearly finishing the fight at one point with that rear naked choke attempt. This was perhaps the most interesting round to discuss because I saw it as a 10-8 round. I believe all 3 judges saw it as a 10-8 round for Chimaev. What did you think, Phil?
I thought it was a clear 10-8 round. While you made the point that there wasn't a ton of really devastating shots that Chimaev landed, there were a few that were pretty strong. They were consistent, and it was, Usman. Traffic. Yeah, exactly. And Usman really didn't. I don't think he landed anything. Maybe a few shots going backwards, just to fire back a few times. But really, as you just said, it was one direction, and I gave it 10-8 to Chimaev.
We go into round 2, and feints were keeping both fighters a bit hesitant in the second round, and you could see the crowd starting to get a bit restless as a result. And yeah, the pace was slow, but that was beneficial to Usman here, who just seemed to be the sharper striker, beating Chimaev to the punch on a lot of his jabs and straight punches. It was a pretty close round, I would say, because whenever Chimaev did throw, he was throwing with clear power. He really puts a lot into each of his strikes as someone who's scored a lot of ridiculous knockouts. But I thought Usman was a bit more impactful, especially at one point he lands this hard jab, which was clearly the most impactful moment of the round. Chimaev gets a takedown near the end, but he doesn't really do anything with it. I thought that this was a fairly clear round for Usman. I can see the case for Chimaev, but when I look at damage as the top scoring criteria, it just seemed to me as though Usman he got more of a reaction out of Chimaev with his shots. He outlanded him throughout the round. he kept Chimaev from doing anything with his top control time near the end. How did you see this one, Phil?
So I saw it the same way. I thought that Usman just landed a few cleaner shots. I think the strike counts was fairly even, but it just seemed like Usman really got the timing of Khamzat as it was entering. It was just his strikes just had a little bit more impact, and then that late takedown. Yeah, he got a takedown, but he really didn't do anything with it whatsoever. So it's if it had been even until that point, yes, that can be the deciding difference from a control perspective. But I think that it was pretty clear that Usman got the edge in the striking, particularly in the last couple minutes of the round. So I gave it to him.
We go into round 3. Usman defends a takedown attempt to start the round, and he lands this hard right hand, prompting Chimaev to respond with one of his own. Chimaev's shooting for takedowns, but Usman's doing a good job of defending, and as the round wears on, he's growing more and more confident. He starts to push forward. He's throwing 1-2s. The crowd is starting to rally behind Kamaru Usman, who's pushing the pace. He's landing at a fairly successful rate too. Like, he's not just winning shots; he is clipping Chimaev when he moves forward. Eventually, Chimaev defends a takedown attempt from Usman, and he shoots for one of his own in response, and he succeeds, taking the fight back to the ground. He has a decent amount of time to work here, and he moves into half guard, but once again, he's not really doing that much with his position here. And this time, Usman escapes back to his feet with time remaining, and he just throws down of Chimaev until time expires. I scored this round for Kamaru Usman as well. How did you see it, Phil?
So I think this was the toughest round to score in the fight. I gave it to Chimaev. It was similar to round 2 in that Usman was getting the better of Chimaev on the feet, but Chimaev was landing, so it wasn't like it was entirely one-sided. And then Chimaev did get that takedown, this time maintaining top control much longer. He did land some strikes, nothing devastating, but unlike round 2, he was able to maintain that position and land some shots. And then when they finally did get up at the last 30 seconds of the round, yes, it was Usman who flurried, but Khamzat was answering back as well. So maybe you can say Usman got the better of the exchange, but it wasn't like Khamzat didn't hit him back. So super close round. I don't have a problem really with someone scoring it for Usman, but I did give it to Khamzat ultimately because it was just so much top control and he was landing in that position.
So the judges were split on round 3. 2 of them gave round 3 to Usman. 1 of them gave round 3 to Chimaev, but one judge also gave Chimaev the second round. So we get 2 scorecards of 29-27 in favor of Chimaev and 128-28 for a draw. Khamzat Chimaev wins your fight by majority decision. A pretty, obviously a debated scorecard given how close those last 2 rounds were, but I think most people were in agreement that at the very least, this was like Usman. The first round was unfortunately kind of a deal breaker for him in terms of getting his arm raised because it was a clear 10-8 round, I think, on most people's scorecards. Regardless, I thought this was a very, very, very impressive performance from Kamaru Usman on just 2 weeks' notice against one of the more dangerous fighters at welterweight or middleweight. He was taken down early. He had to dig in deep because it's not a position you see Kamaru Usman in often, taken down and dominated like that. But I thought he was very clearly the better striker. I thought he was landing the harder shots, and I thought he had the better cardio despite no training camp. So he may have lost the fight, but I thought this was more of an indictment of Usman's greatness than a standout performance from Khamzat Chimaev.
Yeah, I agree. I thought, he did very well to recover from horrible position in round 1, came back, was able to, be very effective with his boxing. This is kind of the second time we've seen Khamzat have a 3-round performance where he's faded a little bit. a lot of questions wondering like what would happen if there were 2 more rounds to this fight, right? Kamaru Usman, you're somebody who's just accustomed to 5-round fights and going 5 rounds typically. As we've seen many times with him. Now, Chimaev did mention later that he injured his wrist in the first round, so that could have played a factor into how effective his striking is or was during rounds 2 and 3. But I do think you have to wonder how well he prepared he would be for somebody like Sean Strickland, who we know can go 5 rounds, can bring the pressure to him, and I think he's going to need to do a lot to prepare for a 5-round fight and maintain that intensity and pace that he's known for. What do you think about that potential matchup? Do you think that that's what the UFC should go with? And do you still have questions on Khamzat's ability to go 5 rounds?
Starting with the cardio, yeah, it's definitely a concern for Khamzat Chimaev at this point. It is worth noting that he was getting the better of the wrestling throughout this fight. Kamaru Usman has some of the highest takedown defense in MMA history, but Chimaev was able to take him down multiple times and keep him down for a significant amount of time. That's impressive in its own right, and also takes a lot out of you, holding a fighter like Usman down for that long. It's also worth noting that at middleweights, who's going to do that aside from Kamaru Usman? Who has that wrestling pedigree or ability? It's a bit of a barren division, honestly. There isn't that many strong contenders, strong wrestlers in the division. I think Robert Whittaker is someone who, if he works his way back into the position, he's a very difficult fighter to just beat with a wrestling heavy approach. But when I look at the majority of names in the conversation right now, I think that wrestling heavy attack will benefit Chimaev in those fights more than it did here against Kamaru Usman or than it did against Gilbert Burns, who's very dangerous on the ground in his own right. And Chimaev wasn't even looking for takedowns in that one. As far as the fight against Sean Strickland goes, I think the UFC's made it pretty clear that's what they want next. I favor Chimaev pretty heavily in that fight.
Okay. And what about Kamaru Usman? Impressive performance, short notice, but at middleweight. And, he's somebody who is a former welterweight champion. He's lost twice to the current welterweight champion, Leon Edwards. Would you like to see him stay at middleweight? Would you like to see him go back to welterweight and take on some potential contenders there?
Usman's in a really interesting place right now, because if we just look throughout his last 3 fights, he has this one, a loss against Chimaev, but, super impressive performance, weight class up on 2 weeks' notice. Fight before that, a very competitive loss to Leon Edwards. And the fight before that, he absolutely dominated Leon Edwards before getting caught at the end. So I find it actually very tough to rank exactly where Kamaru Usman's at right now compared to his peak, and where he compares when we're talking about the best fighters at welterweight and middleweight. Obviously, he's still in that conversation. I don't need to see him fight Leon Edwards again. They've done it 3 times now. We know how they stand. I don't need to see him fight Colby Covington again. That's already happened twice over. I would rather he stay at middleweight. He called for a fight with Dricus du Plessis, I believe, after the show. And you know what? I'm completely down for that fight.
So no Bilal Muhammad then.
Oh my, Bilal Muhammad. I forgot the name. I don't know what Bilal Muhammad. I feel like Bilal Muhammad probably has a fight booked or something and none of us even know about it.
I think I think the idea was he was supposed to fight Usman. That's what it sounded like the UFC was sort of aiming for, but because
I actually would like to see that fight if it were to happen, but I prefer him to stay at middleweight now, just because with Colby Covington and Leon Edwards fighting for the title later this year, I just don't want to see that fight again.
So DDP again misses out on a title shot. And
oh yeah, that's what he gets for pulling out of a fight once. He is forever disgraced in the UFC's book.
And your book too, apparently.
No, I quite like him.
But you think that Robert Whittaker would do better to get Khamzat than DDP?
Yeah, just stylistically, I think Whitaker is a tougher matchup for Khamzat Chimaev. Just he has a very, I think if you have a wrestling heavy approach or you're an especially wild striker, that's something that Whitaker can always capitalize on. I say that, but Dricus du Plessis kind of fits the bill of a guy with a wild style, but
Hmm.
nonetheless. Dricus du Plessis just got screwed by the UFC, and they're going to make him fight again. And it's unfortunate, but we've seen it over and over and over again. Just look at poor Bilal Muhammad, right?
All right. So moving talking about Wild, uh, we had a very interesting, I guess you could say, light heavyweight matchup as Magomed Ankalaev took on Johnny Walker. Magomed Ankalaev, this is his first fight since that draw with Jan Blachowicz from last year. One of the most lackluster sort of finales to a UFC main event ever. But he was looking to rebound here, taking on a pretty high profile fight on a high profile card. And why don't you tell us what happened here?
So the fight starts by Walker and Ankalaev trading leg kicks. A right hook from Ankalaev finds its target, and he lands this hard body shot. And after he lands the hard shot to the body, you could see Walker just kind of crumbling in on himself. But as Ankalaev steps forward, Walker just jumps up with a flying knee as though he is playing possum. Unfortunately, the flying knee doesn't really find its target, and Ankalaev just steps in, taking him down in the process. The Walker kind of scoots his way over to the cage where Ankalaev's in top position, and as Walker is grounded, what does Ankalaev do? He knees him in the head. So the referee stops the action. The doctor is brought in to check on Johnny Walker, and he asks Walker a number of questions, including what country is he in. Apparently, Johnny Walker responds, "Somewhere in the desert." And that's that. The fight is called off. It's a no contest at 3 minutes and 13 seconds of the first round. Uh, this was peak light heavyweight MMA. I don't know what else to say. I wasn't looking forward to this fight. It was a funny ending and a complete disaster as the fighters were nearly ready to brawl in the middle of the cage after. Like they had the entire security team in there, all the coaches, Dana White. They were all just trying to stop Johnny Walker from losing his mind after the referee's decision here, or the doctor's decision. But this was a complete disaster.
Yeah, it seemed like Johnny Walker didn't even understand that the fight was called off. He tried to go after Magomed Ankalaev numerous times. He pushed the referee out of the way at one point and kept trying to get the fight to resume. It finally took Dana White to step into the octagon and to cool things down. Then when the results were read and it was called a no contest, it looked like they were going to be cool for a second as they touched gloves, but apparently Ankalaev took something the wrong way and was ready to throw down once more. And they cleared them out of the cage real fast. And, another, unclimactic finish for Magomed Ankalaev,
Yeah.
2 in a row. I mean, do you run this one back, Eric? I mean, I guess the post-fight theatrics could be used in a promotional material.
Okay, what if I told you that there was a fight for an interim championship or a vacant championship even, and these two fighters they fought to a draw because that's just how it ended, and neither was awarded the championship at the end. And instead of rebooking the fight for the title, the UFC just said, "You know what? Fuck these guys. They don't get another title shot. This guy gets to go fight Johnny Walker in the middle of the desert, and we're never going to hear from him again." There's no sense to this division and its ongoings. Nothing. There's no logical course of action in which these fights get made. Um, could they run this fight back? Sure, yeah, do an Apex main event. Who cares? But I mean, I'm not interested in it. Perhaps some people will be. I think Ankalaev will run through Johnny Walker if the fight gets remade. I wasn't, I didn't see enough from Johnny Walker throughout the short duration of this fight to make me think that he was going to win. So I'm personally not interested in it. Will the UFC run it back? Maybe. Who cares? Do you care, Phil?
I mean, I don't. I guess I don't really care. I think Ankalaev is a guy who, as you more than alluded to, deserves to be at the top of the division and fighting for a title or something significant. Of course, there's a title fight coming up in a few weeks at UFC 295 as Yuri Prohaska takes on Alex Pereira. So yeah, I mean, I think maybe Ankalaev waits for that to play out, and hopefully he gets a shot at the title. I mean, he didn't. I wanted to say he didn't do anything wrong here, but he did land an illegal knee.
No, he probably should have been disqualified. It was a completely intentional illegal blow. So this probably should have been a DQ win for Johnny Walker, but there is no typical ruling for these. The referee just calls what they want in these situations, it seems. So whatever. Light heavyweight is a very uninteresting division right now. Thankfully, regardless of the standings and the title picture, we do have Yuri Prohaska coming back to fight Alex Pereira, which will be super entertaining.
Yeah, of course, Jamal Hill, that interim champion, being injured and having to relinquish his belt. And so, I mean, I don't even want to go through the lineage of the UFC light heavyweight title. I mean, technically, John Jones is probably still champion somewhere out there, right?
I mean, he vacated so many times that I don't even know. I feel like ever since 2015, this title has just been in no man's land.
All right. So going forward through the card, we had a middleweight battle between Ikram Aliskerov taking on Warlley Alves, somebody who I did not peg to fight on a UFC pay-per-view in 2023, but nonetheless, here he was.
That was my thoughts exactly. When I was looking down this pay-per-view card and I saw that Warlley Alves made it onto the main card of the pay-per-view, it was sometimes the UFC is just incredibly obvious with their desired results. It's a Bellator MMA move right there. Bellator loves to do it, where especially on their prelims, where they'll take the guy that they're interested in and they will give him somebody with just absolutely no shot. And that's exactly what the UFC did right here, because Ikram Aliskerov, he is genuinely a very, very dangerous fighter. His only professional loss was a quick knockout loss to Khamzat Chimaev. And if your one loss is like a flash knockout to Chimaev, that doesn't say much about your lack of abilities or lack of ceiling as a fighter. This guy is for real, and you saw it in this fight. He immediately steps in with a hard leg kick. He lands this heavy combination after Alves goes in for a leg kick of his own. A jab from Aliskerov just drops Alves, and as Alves tries to pick himself up, Aliskerov steps forward with a flying knee, rocking him even further. Alves is hurt badly, and Aliskerov just unleashes a flurry of strikes until Alves crumbles down against the cage. Aliskerov wins by TKO at 2 minutes and 7 seconds of the first round. He was a massive favorite going into the fight. He made good on those odds. And you know what? After the fight, Dana White was talking about Aliskerov immediately jumping to ranked opposition. And in a middleweight division that's not that stacked right now, I think I'd favor him over a lot of guys in that division.
Yeah, certainly very impressive performance. Of course, the level of opposition doesn't tell you too much, but look, if you're trying to make a run and they put super low ranked guys against you, you do need to run through them, and mission accomplished right here. One thing that might be worthwhile to mention, and I forgot to say at the top of the card, we had John Anik, Paul Felder, and Daniel Cormier on the call here. Daniel Cormier with the bizarre introduction of Warlley Alves. I mean, I think he said that he even fought for a title at one point.
I know. I thought I heard that too.
Right?
Who does he think Warlley Alves is?
I think he's Thiago Alves.
That's what I thought too. Does he think Warlley Alves is Thiago Alves?
Yes.
Cormier was a bit off all night, but that one really cracked me up. We have former title challenger Warlley Alves. I mean, he fought Kamaru Usman at one point, so that's maybe what Cormier was confused by. I don't know. Regardless, sure, let's just say Alves. We can just throw these things at anyone. He probably challenged for some title at some point, right? He challenged for the tough title, the tough Brazil 3 title, and he won. So you can go with whatever you want to promote these guys.
Any particular name you'd like to see Aliskerov take on at middleweight?
Hold on. Buy me some time here as I look up the rankings, because I don't even know who's in the picture when we're talking about that 15th to 10th ranked spot here. Pulling them up now. Okay, how about Chris Curtis? Chris Curtis seems like a fine test if we're talking about the guys who are kind of situated at that 10th to 15th rank.
Yeah, I think that's pretty solid. All right.
You don't want to put him against Paul Craig, because that's how you lose a prospect. How many of these guys just get thrown to Paul Craig and get Paul Craig and find themselves on the Fight Pass prelims for the next 6 years, building themselves back up?
All right. So moving on to open up the pay-per-view portion of the evening. We had Said Nurmagomedov taking on Muin Gafurov. And I gotta admit, I was not familiar with this Gafurov character, and I doubt I'm going to be remembering him much after this as well.
Yeah, much like the fight we talked about, this was one of those fights where there may have been a desired result from the UFC here, given that Said Nurmagomedov is a nearly ranked fighter who's looked very good throughout his UFC run, while Gafurov has had one fight in the promotion in which he lost to John Castaneda. So obviously Nurmagomedov a heavy favorite going into this fight, and as it plays out, Gafurov just kind of charges him to begin the fight and kind of wraps him up in the clinch against the cage as he's shooting for a double leg. Nurmagomedov just locks in a ninja choke immediately as he's doing it, and he forces the submission in 1 minute and 13 seconds of the first round. A very quick win for Said Nurmagomedov.
Yeah, much like the middleweight contest we just spoke about, Nurmagomedov was put into this fight to make a statement. He did. He now has 2 of the quickest submission wins in bantamweight history. Is he somebody that you think needs to jump up the rankings and fight, significant opposition like we were just discussing with Aliskerov?
Yeah, maybe not to the same degree as Aliskerov, just because the bantamweight division is a lot deeper than middleweight. Like at middleweight, when you have someone with clear talent, I think you gotta push them as hard as you can immediately. Well, at bantamweight, you're gonna struggle with your top 30 ranked fighters, just because the guys there are so good. With that being said, Nurmagomedov is somebody who's right on that brink of a top 15 opponent. He fought Jonathan Martinez in his last fight. He lost. That's why he's not fighting a ranked opponent here. But I think this was enough of a quick finish to get him back on track. And I think we'll probably see him as the ranked opponent next time.
Okay, on to the preliminary card, which I promise we will not spend too much time on, but I think there are a couple of fights worth noting, particularly that featured prelim, which had a flyweight bout between Tim Elliott and Mohammad Mokaev. Mokaev, undefeated, big-time prospect, and put into pretty much his most high-profile fight to date.
Yeah, so this was one of the fights I did want to talk about. It was one of the more interesting ones on the card, I thought. Mokaev has looked quite impressive throughout his UFC run. He's the type of fighter who we've seen him in tough situations, like just his last fight. I'm sorry, I forget the fighter he was in there against, but he was he was in the deepest knee bar you will ever see in the sport, to the extent that everybody watching thought that this guy was going to be out for forever following this brutal hyperextension, and he came back to win that fight in the very same round. So he's a very resilient fighter, a very high level fighter. With that being said, Tim Elliott marked a significant rise in competition. And I did think you saw that play out here. I'm not going to go through the entire fight here, but as the fight begins, we see Tim Elliott kind of doing his best. He has a very awkward style. He mixes in his striking and grappling well, but his bread and butter is his wrestling. And you see him getting a degree of success here. Some potentially illegal knees find a target in the process for him. Going into the final round of the fight, it was fairly competitive. I think most had it 19-19, but you could even argue 20-18 for Elliott. And Elliott's doing good work in the third round as well. Once again, he's coming very close to some illegal knees. And let me tell you, this preliminary card, this never-ending preliminary card, was just chock full of fouls. It was probably the most fouls in a 4-hour period you'll ever see in MMA. But regardless, none of them get called. And Elliott's in a really good position with time running down. And Mokaev just kind of, like, from his knees, picks Elliott up and tosses him down to the ground, where he takes top position, works his way to Elliott's side, catches him in an arm triangle, and forces the submission at 3 minutes and 3 seconds of the third round. A really impressive win from Muhammad Mokaev. He garnered some criticism for really playing the grounded opponent game throughout this fight. It looked like he was trying to get Elliott disqualified at times with those illegal knees, but it's the game. It's the game that's played by many, and it ultimately worked out for him here, securing the third round submission.
Yeah, he was definitely playing the game. Tim Elliott was, he was trying to lift him up to be able to do the knees, right? So it was like he'd plant the hands down, and so he tried to lift him up and land the knees, and the ref did stop it twice, but, reviewed the footage, saw the shots weren't actually illegal, and put them back in the same position. So I thought it was actually pretty good reffing in this case, but ultimately none of that really mattered, because Mokaev was able to secure that submission win in the third round with the arm triangle. Very impressive performance, I thought, from him. Tim Elliott, a savvy veteran, very wild opponent, difficult to deal with. And Mokaev, I thought, handled it very, very well. And this will put him in the top 10. I guess the question is, who do you put him up against? I'm looking at the flyweight rankings, and the name that I see that I think would be a pretty interesting one, super tough test, but somebody coming off of 2 losses, Kai Kara France.
Yeah, he called for Kara France 2 or 3 times in his post-fight interview as well. I think that's a smart fight to make. It would really show you the level that Muhammad Mokaev's at one way or the other, and it would be a tough test for Kai Kara France as well. At flyweight, there aren't really a lot of easy matchups in your top 15. Other names that he called out, I think, were Amir Abazi and Manel Comp. I could see those fights happening too, but I'm with you. The Kai Kara France match would interest me the most.
Mokaev also asked to be the backup fighter for the upcoming flyweight title fight between Alexander Pantoja and Brandon Royval, which is supposed to be happening at UFC 296. So, depending on if anything happens there, we could see Mokaev jump back into action for a title shot pretty soon.
That wouldn't shock me, although, those guys are pretty regular with making it to their fights. That's a good fight, by the way. I haven't given it much thought since it was announced, but I'm just thinking about it now. Royval and Pantoja, that should be fun.
All right, why don't you just give us some of the results, and then we can stop on maybe the 2 other interesting fights that occurred on the prelims.
We had Trevor Peak defeating Mohammad Yahya by unanimous decision with scores of 29 to 28 and 230s to 27. And I think that this next fight, it has to be one of the interesting fights in which you mentioned, because I had this specifically marked down as if there was only one fight we were going to talk about from these prelims, it was going to be this fight right here. And that's Javid Basharat versus Victor Henry, perhaps the most talked about fight of this entire card. I'm not going to talk about the first round. It sucked. We're going to go into round 2. And not long into the first round, second round, seconds, a low blow from Basharat just floors Victor Henry. This guy is in as much pain as you have ever seen a human being. He is just like writhing in pain on the ground. We see the replays. It looks bad. And the doctor comes in to check on him. And the doctor says, no, it didn't land there. You're faking it, basically. and Henry's reaction to this, just telling him, no, it caught exactly where I think it did. It was a peak MMA here. A horrible reaction from this doctor. And Victor Henry is sent to the hospital afterwards. He is like vomiting backstage to accuse this man of faking when I don't think you could fake the level of pain this guy was in. Quite the moment. It's a no contest at 15 seconds of the second round. What did you think about this disaster, Phil?
I mean, yeah, it was painful to watch. I mean, the dude was in agony. It kind of reminded me of a long-time fight. Chris Tuchscherer. Do you remember this fight? Former UFC heavyweight.
You're gonna have to go further.
I forget who he took on, but maybe it was Gabriel Gonzaga, I think. Yeah. And he got hit with a nut shot, and he was just writhing in pain. And he ended up actually losing the fight because he couldn't continue, which is just absolute insanity. But it really reminded me of that one. I mean, I think, let me see when that fight took place. That would have been in 2009, if that's the one that I'm thinking of. Maybe I don't know. I could have my fights confused here. But yeah, just a horrible situation. And then the ref to come in there, the doctor to come in there and say, to say, like, you know, like, just absolute insanity, and led to a lot of criticism of this doctor. Of course, we mentioned earlier or later in the night, played a significant role in the Johnny Walker fight. So Dana White mentioning that this doctor was fairly inexperienced. I'm assuming he means inexperienced in dealing with fights, but you know, the UFC is hiring these people, so whose fault is that? Yeah, just awful. And I really hope that Henry makes a full recovery and there's no long-term damage to him.
Yeah, moving on as we go through these prelims here. We have Mike Breeden defeat Anshul Jubilee by knockout at 3 minutes of the third round. Now, this was a very entertaining fight.
Yep.
Jubilee kind of, I wouldn't say dominated, but was a clear step ahead of Breeden throughout the first 2 rounds. He was getting the better of the striking exchanges. I think he recorded a knockdown in the second round. And then we go into round 3. And Mike Breeden's corner must have gave him like the speech of a lifetime, because he looks like a different person entirely. He's barking like a dog, marching forward. He's throwing wild shots while he's taunting. His corner is barking like a dog with him. You could hear them like on the audio from the octagon. And Jubilee just kind of shuts down after a really solid start to the fight. It seemed as though he was either gassed or he had no idea how to handle this pressure, and he was more or less a frozen opponent for the remainder of the fight as Breeden teed off on him until he ultimately secured the knockout at 3 minutes of that third and final round. An impressive comeback victory, complete with some wild theatrics.
Yeah, yes. Jubilee, you know, he looked promising. He was type of fighter, though. He was making some like pretty elementary mistakes that Breeden wasn't really able to capitalize on in rounds 1 and 2, and Cormier was pointing those out. And then ultimately, yeah, he just kind of shut down. maybe it was gas, maybe it was, who knows what, but he wasn't able to deliver in round 3. Breeden was super game, pours it on, and ends up getting the KO. One thing to note about this is that Breeden missed weight by 3.5 pounds, so a significant margin. And as the commentators noted, it looked like he had a cut above his eye beforehand, which did open up during the fight. And so that might have been one of the reasons why he wasn't able to make weight. So always sucky when the guy who doesn't make weight gets the W, but Breeden, came back here. Jubilee had more than ample opportunity to win this fight, and Breeden, pulled it out of the fire. So kudos to him.
As we continue along the Fight Pass prelims that took place about 24 hours ago now, we have Muhammad Nurmagomedov defeating Nathaniel Wood by unanimous decision, scores of 29-28 all. Victoria Dudikova defeating Jinyu Fry by unanimous decision, 29-28 all. And to start the card, we had Shara Magomedov defeating Bruno Silva by unanimous decision with all scores of 30-27. So that was UFC 294. A top-heavy card.
Yes, definitely the main card more interesting than the preliminary card, not just from name value, but also from the in-cage action. I did want to touch on the Nathaniel Wood versus Muhammad Naimov fight because, Wood is somebody who is, strong prospect, and he kind of got a raw deal in this fight, I believe, because there were multiple strikes to clear fouls by Naimov in here, and you really could have made the case for a point deduction against Naimov in this one. Wood ended up, did very well in the third round, poured it on, looked very good with his striking. Naimov mostly controlled with the wrestling. He had some good striking as well, but those illegal shots, it's hard to quantify how impactful they were. So, and there were so many of them that I really feel you needed to deduct a point, and it would have at least led to a draw for Wood.
Yeah, definitely a tough outing for Nathaniel Wood. He was a pretty sizable favorite going into the fight. So to Naimov's credit, he did pull off the upset win here in only his second UFC fight against the guy who's kind of on the verge of cracking the rankings there. So credit to Naimov. He showcased some good timing with his takedowns, but an unfortunate result for Nathaniel Wood.
Yes, and so that wraps up UFC 294. We had Performance of the Night bonuses for Islam Makhachev, Ikram Aliskerov, Said Nurmagomedov, and Mohammad Mokaev. No Fight of the Night award for Usman and Chimaev. And, kind of feel bad for... we were just talking about him. What's his face? Breeden, but I guess Breeden missed weight. So he was not qualified for performance bonus. So the UFC returns. They take a rare weekend off next weekend, and they will return for UFC Fight Night. Jailton Almeida, super exciting heavyweight, taking on Derek Lewis, who got his first win in some time not too long ago and re-signed with the UFC. That will be taking place on November 4th from Sao Paulo, Brazil. I'm trying to see if there's anything else interesting on here. You've got Rodolfo Vieira coming back, taking on Armin Petrosian. Angela Hill's buried down here somewhere. But so not too much to get excited about other than that main event. And then John will return on November 11th as the UFC returns to Madison Square Garden, as you've got John Jones taking on Stipe Miocic for the UFC heavyweight title, and you've also got a light heavyweight bout between Yuri Prohaska and Alex Pereira. Also on that card, Mackenzie Dern taking on Jessica Andrade, Matt Frivola versus Benoit Saint Denis, and that's about it in terms of interesting fights on that card. What do you think about that John Jones versus Stipe Miocic main event there? What a lot of people think it might be Stipe Miocic's last fight ever, win or lose.
I wouldn't be surprised if it's both fighters' last fight ever, win or lose, to be honest with you. I think for both guys, it's you win and you have a hell of a name at the end of your resume. What more is there to accomplish? You really want to go in there with the Sergei Pavloviches of the world who don't have the name value, but definitely have that knockout power. Jones and Miocic are both fighters who I think most would agree are past their primes at this point. The question is just, is Stipe that far gone that he would no longer be competitive with a John Jones who's still very good? I mean, it's impossible to say, especially for Stipe, who's had like one fight in the last 4 years, right? I guess you could say the same thing about John Jones, right? One
Mm-hmm.
fight in the last 4 years. So I think it's cool that they're doing a fight between the greatest heavyweight in UFC history and the greatest light heavyweight of all time while they can. It's something they missed out on with my dream matchup of Jose Aldo and Dominic Cruz. But I can't say I'm as excited about the fight itself as I would have been like 5 years ago when both guys were, a bit closer to their peaks as performers. The co-main event, I think, will be the fight of the night.
Yeah, I mean, two super exciting fighters, Alex Pereira and Yuri Prohaska. I mean, Pereira's last fight wasn't the most thrilling, which is something unusual for him. But I mean, Yuri Prohaska is always super entertaining, and I don't see how this fight could be bad. So super excited about that one. Now, I did mention that the UFC is off next weekend, but that doesn't mean that there isn't exciting fight action, right?
Of
Right?
course, how could I
Because
forget?
we have our guy. He's our guy. He's representing our sport. Francis Ngannou is going to box Tyson Fury on Saturday, October 28th from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Eric, what's your interest level on this fight?
0. My interest level on all of these freak show fights has been very, very low. I think you know which one I was most excited to watch. The one I was actually excited to watch was Anderson Silva versus Tito Ortiz, just because I knew exactly what would happen and it'd be really funny. I know what's gonna happen here too. We all know what's gonna happen. It's not as funny.
Yeah. Let me see what the odds are for that one, because I imagine it's like way out there. Let's
Do you
see.
think that Ngannou, like just according to the betting line, Ngannou has better odds to win than Conor McGregor did against Floyd Mayweather? You would assume so, right? But I don't know if
I
if the hype would be there.
Interesting. So right now on FanDuel, Ngannou is a plus 720 and Tyson Fury is a minus 1350.
So that's like a considerable. Ngannou's considerably a bigger underdog than McGregor was.
Yeah, I think that the difference is the fact that, McGregor was the bigger fighter here. When he fought Mayweather. And
exactly.
So in this case, they're, roughly going to be the same size. And also, Tyson Fury was certainly not looking terribly in shape during the initial press conference that they had for this one. But yeah, I mean, it would be very surprising if Ngannou is able to pull out the win in his first boxing match. I mean, I'd be shocked, but maybe you never know. You never know.
Yeah, maybe he will somehow catch Fury with one of his winning like shovel hammer fists, and he will prove himself to be the best boxer in the world. I don't know what to say about this. It's not for me, but I know some people are into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be on at a reasonable time, so maybe I'll check it out. I mean, I'm certainly going to watch the highlights of it at the very least. So, I mean, I'm kind of interested, and I'm glad that Ngannou is getting paid, definitely. Getting a lot of money, and but yeah, I'm unless he pulls off the miracle, which I'm not betting. I'm not too excited to see him in boxing. I'm generally not excited to see UFC fighters in boxing or bare knuckle fighting. I like to see MMA fighters do MMA, and I like to see boxers do boxing. And I don't like to see YouTubers do each. either. So,
Yeah.
with that said, I think it's time we bid the stream adieu. I do feel that we do need a brief Spider-Man 2 review, since it seems like the YouTube chat is clamoring for it, because I know that's outside of UFC coverage that's been occupying much of your time, Eric.
Okay. No spoilers. You are all safe. But I have recently finished Spider-Man 2, Insomniac Spider-Man 2, not Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2. An excellent game. Go out of your way to play it. Some of the most, like, the gameplay is absolutely excellent. A fun story mode. The side missions are really great, and graphically, it's a stunning game as well. So go check it out if you have a PS5.
Awesome. And with that, we will say goodbye. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. Thank you to all the postmarks. Remember to like this video. Remember to hit that subscribe button. And if you want more amazing content, why don't you check out postwrestlingcafe.com or patreon.com/postwrestling and see the amazing amount of additional shows that you receive each and every month from the tremendous team that is at Post Wrestling, only for a few dollars a month. What an amazing deal. So go on over, sign up, and thanks again. And Eric will be back in just a few weeks with John to cover UFC 295. Thank you, everybody.